I'm just going to come right out and say it. America was founded by a bunch of entitled, lying traitors, and these traitors passed down a myth to their descendants, not history. The myth that we rebelled against a tyrannical king. Over time, this lie has been expanded upon. It's evolved. Now, monarchy itself is tyrannical, which is objectively complete nonsense. You know, to disprove this myth, one doesn't have to dig all that deep. Just examine the plain, simple facts, and you'll notice there's a whole lot of tyranny and dictatorship missing from the story. Here's what it all comes down to. We didn't rebel against George III. We rebelled against Parliament. Not only was George not a tyrant, but nothing that the British did leading up to the war was tyrannical in the first place. And even if any of it was, George wasn't behind it even if he had wanted to be. Let's break down what actually happened and see if the colonists were right to call any of it tyranny. And let's see how many of Great Britain's actions were done on the orders of George III. The first order of business is understanding that the British monarchy has been kneecapped since the year 1215, which was 560 years before the American Revolution. Britain has gone back and forth since the Magna Carta, returning and revoking powers to the monarchy since then. But you can bet Parliament was the true power in the nation by the time of the American Revolution. I can't stress this enough. The king wields virtually no power. The power is Parliament. The monarchy is a figurehead, which makes the entire situation ever more infuriating. The crown gets the blame for things it couldn't have done even if it had wanted to. All is done in the name of the crown when the crown had nothing to do with it. I can't believe people haven't understood this for centuries, but I'll say it anyway. Figureheads shouldn't be blamed for anything. They can't do anything, at least not anything substantial, and not on their own authority. In the year 1750, 25 years before the American Revolution, Britain and France controlled loosely defined and disputed territories in North America. Both sides claimed ownership of the Ohio River Basin, and to further solidify their claim, the French started building forts there. The French claimed it was to protect Native Americans from the increasing number of British settlers expanding westward. The most important fort was Duquesne, at present-day Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. George Washington was sent to prevent the construction of this fort, and long story short, the resulting battles became what is called the 7 Years' War. Well, I mean, we call it the French and Indian War, but the greater conflict was the 7 Years' War. Of course, with all things history, I'm greatly simplifying the story for the sake of brevity. So, Great Britain ultimately wins the 7 Years' War, the result of which was France losing all of New France, which is this area here, and Spain lost Florida. But after the war, Britain was now deep in debt. British Prime Minister George Grenville urged, not forced, urged, colonial assemblies to voluntarily contribute to war costs, particularly for maintaining 10,000 troops in North America for their own defense. The colonies refused. They refused because they prioritized local control and wanted clear, direct benefits, which they were not guaranteed. So, Parliament passed the Sugar Act. It is expedient that new provisions and regulations should be established for improving the revenue of this kingdom. It is just and necessary that a revenue should be raised for defraying the expenses of defending, protecting, and securing the same. The bill was introduced by Prime Minister George Grenville. George III did not introduce or pass the Sugar Act. I'm not sure how thoroughly I have to spell this out going forward to prove my point, but I'm going to be emphasizing this every step of the way. George was not behind these bills. He assented to them, but we'll get to that later. The Sugar Act can reasonably be seen as the first authoritative action that led up to the Revolution, and Britain was completely justified in wanting more revenue from the colonies, because it virtually bankrupted itself to support the colonies in their war. Let me put this plainly, France and Britain were not good friends back then. France was intentionally impeding British settlers from moving further west, not to mention cozying up to Native American tribes in open opposition toward the British. The British could have just told the colonies, well, good luck, and then dealt with the European theater of the war, but Britain fought for the colonies because in their eyes, the colonies were no less British than the homeland itself. When you own something, you are responsible for it. This isn't complicated. Then came the Stamp Act in 1765, the purpose of which was just more of the Sugar Act's purpose. Again, the colonies didn't like it. They didn't fear further attacks from France, so they disagreed with the 10,000 British troops stationed in the colonies, and therefore disagreed with paying for them through additional taxes, just like the first time. The Stamp Act, or rather the reaction to it, is where the phrase "no taxation without representation" came from. I'm going to pause my little history lesson to address this slogan. You see, everyone is familiar with the phrase "no taxation without representation," yet everyone believes America was founded in rebellion to a tyrannical king. Okay, so what does representation have to do with the king? Representation with what? Representation in what? The king's bedroom or something? Representation in his sock drawer? What the hell do people think representation meant? It meant representation in Parliament. I can't believe I have to say this. Because again, the colonies rebelled against Parliament, not the king. Okay, back to history. The colonists responded to the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act by boycotting British trade, which worked. This prompted Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act, amend the Sugar Act, and reassert its authority. This was called the Declaratory Act, 1766. Yes, we are now 16 years into this, by the way. The Declaratory Act was introduced by Prime Minister Charles Watson Wentworth, not the King. Notice a trend yet? To supplement the Declaratory Act, Parliament passed the 5 Townshend Acts, starting in June 1767 through March 1768. In essence, the British taxed pretty much everything and reaffirmed its authority over the colonies. Tensions rose considerably. Boston happened to be a center for resistance against the unpopular taxation, and it became unstable. Parliament, not George, determined that because of the Treason Act of 1543, people could be sent to England for treason charges, though no one was ever charged. Still, the effort of Parliament to look for treason sparked outrage anyway, so Commander-in-Chief of North America, Thomas Gage, sent 4 regiments to Boston. Newspapers started reporting clashes between civilians and soldiers. Tensions rose even further when a teenager was killed by a customs employee, who was ultimately pardoned. British troops weren't involved in the incident, but it raised tensions with civilians and soldiers anyway, as it was seen as still reflecting on Parliament nonetheless. If you were alive back then and didn't know what was right about to happen, you could probably still predict it anyway. The Boston quote-unquote massacre. It started when Private Hugh White, who was the sole guard on duty at the Boston Custom House, got surrounded by more than 50 Bostonians. They were led by a half-black man named Crispus Attucks, who was the first one to start throwing objects at Hugh and challenged him to fire his weapon. 8 soldiers came to reinforce Private White and shouted at the crowd of now 300 to 400 people to disperse. The crowd kept taunting them to fire, spat at them, and threw objects at them. One of the objects thrown struck a soldier named Private Montgomery, which knocked him down and caused him to drop his musket. Once he recovered, he fired into the crowd. Someone in the crowd carrying a cudgel swung it at Montgomery, then at their captain Thomas Preston, narrowly missing his head. Then the rest of the soldiers fired, though they were not given orders to. The half-black man, who was the first one to start throwing objects at the soldiers, was one of the people killed. It was self-defense, not a massacre. But figures like Samuel Adams and Paul Revere didn't even hesitate to use the most propagandistic descriptor imaginable. And you know what makes this worse in my eyes? It started with one soldier, just one, getting harassed by a mob. The other 8 soldiers simply came to support their comrade, and they were still vastly outnumbered. But never were British soldiers trying to slaughter anyone that day. Now for the most obvious factoid about the Boston Massacre. King George did not order it. We already agree on that, don't we? So why do we still call it a massacre? George didn't send troops to the colonies with the intent of killing people to send a message or anything like that. I can't find records of how George even reacted to the incident, probably because there aren't any. But to those back in the British homeland, it was called the Incident on King Street. One thing is for certain, though. Parliament's response to the incident was to defend the troops and reinforce them further. Yeah, I would want the same. What did the civilians do? They burned down the house of the governor of Massachusetts, Thomas Hutchinson. They started to organize. What followed was 3 years of increasing opposition from the colonies. They continued harassing customs officials, tarring and feathering tax collectors, and destroying British property, such as burning the HMS Gaspee, but not before shooting one of the crew. No, it was not justified. Nobody on the ship wronged anybody not on the ship. In response to the Tea Act of 1773, and frankly, I don't have any desire to explain the Tea Act, it's not important anyway, but most importantly, it was an act of Parliament, not the King. In response to the Tea Act of 1773, activists called the Sons of Liberty threw approximately 10,000 pounds of tea into the Boston harbor, known as the Boston Tea Party. A similar incident in Philadelphia happened, but they just forced the ship delivering the tea to return to England instead. Parliament responded to the Boston Tea Party with what were dubbed the Coercive Acts, or Intolerable Acts. Britain closed the harbor to all trade until the tea was paid for. And given the fact that a whole crowd watched the Sons of Liberty dump the tea into the harbor, I think it was fair to punish the entire harbor for the incident. Not to mention all the other things the colonists had done. Parliament revoked Massachusetts' charter and installed a military governor, Thomas Gage, so that the colony was under Britain's direct authority. This freaked out the rest of the colonies, who feared that they were next in line to lose their quasi-independence, so they convened the Continental Congress. Through what is called the Olive Branch Petition, they asked King George himself to intervene so that war could be avoided. George ignored it completely. He did not even receive it formally. And besides, as I've already explained, the British monarch was just a figurehead back then, like he still is today. So what could he have done anyway? Something to keep in mind that most people probably don't even know about. John Adams, who ultimately became a founding father, was at the time already in full support of American independence. He wrote a letter to a friend, James Warren, saying that this petition to King George served no purpose and that war was inevitable. In fact, he lamented that the colonies hadn't made better preparations for war already. British officials seized this letter, and it reached King George by the time the petition itself reached him. If I were George, I would have had enough of the colonies' behavior by that point too. Now to start wrapping up this history lesson. Militias had always existed in the colonies, namely for defense against attacks from the indigenous, and they were, at the time, most recently used in the Americas during the 7 Years' War, or French and Indian War, fighting alongside the British Army proper. So in short, Americans were already prepared for conflict to a small extent. The trick to maintaining order in Massachusetts was preventing the colonial militias from being effective against British regulars. Thomas Gage, the military governor of Massachusetts, ordered that military supplies and ammunition in Concord, Massachusetts, be seized and destroyed. This was to be carried out by Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith, whose instructions were, and I quote, "Utmost expedition and secrecy to Concord, where you will seize and destroy all military stores. But you will take care that the soldiers do not plunder the inhabitants or hurt private property." Gage deliberately did not give orders to arrest rebel leaders out of fear that it would spark an uprising. How's that for tyranny, leaving rebel leaders alone, and leaving civilians and their property alone? Yeah, so tyrannical. Still wouldn't have been George's orders anyway. Well, on their way to destroy supplies and ammunition in Concord, rebels met them in Lexington. It's still uncertain who shot first, but I say whatever. I just blame it on the rebels because 100% of this entire situation was their fault anyway. It was the shot heard round the world, and that was the start of the American Revolution. So, what was George's involvement? George III was the same as Charles III is today, an otherwise pointless figurehead who only assents to Parliament's decisions. Let's talk about royal assent, shall we? So, for Parliament to pass a bill, it needs the approval, assent, of the monarch. The king's assent is to just give the illusion that Britain still has a king. They don't. A figurehead is no monarch. I just refer to him as a monarch just to make it easier to understand. Technically, the monarch can refuse to give assent to a bill, but no British monarch has exercised this power since 1708, 52 years before George III began his reign. Why has it been so long since the monarch refused to give his royal assent? Because it would trigger a constitutional crisis. The monarch is pressured to act on the will of the government and parliament. He is pressured by historical precedent and the spirit of the British Constitution itself. Every king and queen knows that breaking precedent would only result in Parliament revoking that power anyway. Parliament will get their way no matter what. And if you believe the king's subjects would never try to assert authority over him, well, you don't know British history very well. In other words, Parliament would throw a tantrum if the king exercised any authority they don't like. This has been the way of things since before George III was born. The colonists started this mess. When you look deep into the facts as I have, it's undeniable that the American Revolution was baseless. To me, the colonists sound like they were throwing a years-long temper tantrum, like children. It's easy to trace the motive of every action that Great Britain took leading up to the American Revolution, and in my view, all of their actions were justified. And by their actions, I mean Parliament's actions, because George did little to nothing during all of this. He couldn't have been a tyrant even if he had wanted to be. And as much as I hate assemblies of any kind, whether it's a Congress, or a House of Representatives, or a committee, or a parliament, I still fully agree with every action the British Parliament took during this period. As a monarchist, I wish I could give credit to George, but no, the credit belongs to the British Parliament. I suppose I can thank George for assenting to all of Parliament's decisions here. The Olive Branch petition was pure propaganda for the revolution. They just wanted an excuse to start fighting by saying, look, our tyrannical king is refusing to come to the table. Well, they got their wish. It's easier to blame one person than an entire assembly, because if propagandists had blamed Parliament, it would have made the people stop to think, okay, what is Parliament's thinking here? But when you're blaming just one person, it's easy for sheep to think no further and just attribute tyranny to an individual. The Sugar Act, Parliament. The Stamp Act, Parliament. The Declaratory Act, Parliament. The Townshend Acts, Parliament. The Tea Act, Parliament. The Coercive Acts, Parliament. It was all Parliament, and Parliament was justified anyway. The Boston Massacre was no massacre. It was a moment of panic and of self-defense against a mindless mob that outnumbered the soldiers 33-1 at minimum. The Olive Branch petition was disingenuous, and the British government was right to reject it even if it had been sincere. Nothing the British government did was tyrannical, and in fact went out of its way not to be tyrannical, such as refusing to arrest rebel leaders. America was built on propaganda. America was built on lies. The colonies were never ruled by a tyrant. And you know, when you look at the grand scope of history, all uprisings are left-wing, and they consistently have egalitarian results that are doomed to collapse within 300 years or less. America is close to meeting the same fate as all revolutions. Now that George's name has been cleared, I would like you all to remember one important fact. At least one important fact from this. Most kings throughout history have not been tyrants. It's uncommon. In fact, I would say it's rare. If you understand human nature and the natural pressures of being an autocrat, it makes perfect sense why most kings have not been tyrannical. And in case you don't believe me about that, I'm going to dedicate the next, long while disproving this myth about kings, one king at a time. I'd bet that most of the kings considered tyrants were not. And to you, my fellow monarchists, I ask for your support in this endeavor. I'm tired of people sullying the good name of monarchy, and I'm sure you are too. So please help me in this mission by supporting my channel and my society at the link down below.